Mrs. Dalloway said. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. I think I'll buy the flowers myself.
Hey everyone, I'm Eric from Lonesome Reader, and if you've seen my videos before, you know that I am a huge fan of Virginia Woolf. So I need to share with you today a very exciting new book which has just been published. And it's made me think about her novel Mrs. Dalloway in a whole new way because it is the actual manuscript of that novel. So you can see it's filled with her handwriting and her process of writing this novel. So I've been reading through it and it has quite a few surprises. So I'm excited to share these with you in this book with you. But first I want to talk about my relationship with Virginia Woolf, why I love her so much, like on a personal level, but also on an academic level, why I appreciate her so much. Because I think like a lot of people who love Virginia Woolf's writing, I first read her when I was at university, and I was assigned, I think, a few of her books for a course, but I actually discovered her novel The Waves when I was just wandering around the library one evening, and I picked it up and thought I would start reading it, and I just fell in love with it, and it became my favorite novel ever. But actually, this isn't the book that I would recommend people to start reading if they've never read Virginia Woolf before. That book is actually Mrs. Dalloway. So I have these special editions of her novels, and you can see Vintage brought out these special edition with these beautiful custom designed covers a few years ago, and I wrote an article for the Penguin website talking about Virginia Woolf and the order that I would suggest you read her books in, because even though, you know, I love The Waves so much, I think Mrs. Dalloway is the novel which is best to start reading for a number of reasons. Because Mrs. Dalloway was a huge turning point in her evolution as a writer. It's actually her 5th published book, but it's her first one which fully utilizes this stream of consciousness style of writing that she's most famous for. And I also think it's her most accessible because at least on the surface, the story is quite simple and easy to understand. It's all about Clarissa Dalloway, Mrs. Dalloway, who's throwing a party on one June day. But it's also the story of Septimus, who's a World War I veteran suffering from an extreme case of shell shock that's very advanced. And this is something that the doctors that he goes to see at the time are perilously unequipped to help him deal with. And so these seem like very different characters, but Woolf treats them like two halves of the same coin because they're both sort of at the same point in their lives where larger society feels that they're past their use. So naturally they're reflecting on their past and the choices they've made and how they should progress forward. And Woolf captures their thoughts and feelings as they go about a day in London alongside that of several other characters. And in doing so, she captures the essence of experience as it's really lived, how we're affected by what we perceive around us, how people make judgments and assumptions about us as we walk through the world, and of course, how we also make assumptions about other people as well, how our memories intrude upon our thoughts as we're just going about our day, and how this really changes our experience, and how we see and interact with the world. So that's why Mrs. Dalloway is commonly considered an important book and stands alongside that other big modernist text, which is James Joyce's Ulysses. And it's actually really interesting to read these books alongside each other because they both take place over the course of an ordinary day in June, but they have very different ways of capturing that sense of daily experience. But I think it's easy to assume that Mrs. Dalloway was an inevitability for Woolf to write because she had experimented with styles of writing before, like in her previous book, Jacob's Room, also utilizes this kind of stream of consciousness style of writing. And also, actually, the character of Mrs. Dalloway appeared in several short stories that Virginia Woolf wrote before as well. But since I was kindly given by SP Books this new new edition of the manuscript version of Mrs. Dalloway, I'm starting to see the novel in a whole new light. And because it's made me see that, like, the actual process of her writing this book was very labored and went through many different versions, and the original book that she started with is very different from the book that she ended up with. So let me take a minute and show off this book, because it's so beautiful, because it comes in this big ornate case, and you slip out the manuscript version, and then you see the typescript version of the novel inside. And at the very beginning of the book, there's a new introduction by Michael Cunningham, who wrote the novel The Hours, which is, you know, the ultimate fan fiction book about Virginia Woolf, because he takes as the title of this novel the original title of Mrs. Dalloway, which is The Hours, which is what she was originally going to call the book. And he says in his introduction that he shamelessly, you know, stole the title of the book from her. And so you can see in the beginning here, she was going to call it The Hours, ? And when she started writing it in 1923. And one of her main reasons for doing so is because that she captures time throughout the way, and the punctuation of hours, and marks those hours with the striking of Big Ben. And she records the hour striking throughout the book, so you can sort of follow how time is progressing through the book while the characters are going about their daily life. So time is a really important factor in the novel, and it's something that she writes about a lot in some sections, some of which she eventually cut out. But also, one of the other biggest, most fascinating things I discovered in looking at this manuscript version was that she was originally going to focus on the character of Peter Walsh. So this is a character that had proposed to Clarissa Dalloway at one point, but she had turned him down. And they're still friends and interact with each other, and he's still a character in the book. But Mrs. Dalloway was just going to be a peripheral character in the novel, but she then eventually moved to having center stage in the book. And she used her name in the title, Mrs. Dalloway, but she only used her married name, which is quite significant. And I've been so fascinated going through this text because you can see references to people and relationships and situations which appear in the novel, but in altered versions. There's a section where she contemplates the meaning of propagating the species, which I just think is really interesting. You can almost see her thought process of going through and trying to think about these relationships between man and woman and independence and the meaning of being a parent. And there's an amazing line at the start of one section where she declares, "A delicious idea came to me that I will write anything I want to write." And it's so fascinating seeing Woolf's process, how many false steps she took while whole passages are crossed out, and then little notes she makes at the end of a writing session to pick up where she's going to start writing the next time. And even how her thoughts would collapse into lines squiggled across the page. So I have loved reading through this beautiful edition, and this book is such a treasure. I mean, it's a beautiful object in itself, but also for all the insights it's given me into the novel of Mrs. Dalloway. And I mean, I have to admit, at first, I was a bit frustrated reading through it because, as you can see, Virginia Woolf's handwriting is quite difficult to decipher. But I think they published it in this large-scale format because it does make it easier to read. And also, it became a fun sort of puzzle for me trying to figure out what Virginia Woolf actually wrote, because then I can see things that were left out of the final novel, and then it gave me all these insights behind the actual book. And of course, I mean, it's just amazing having Virginia Woolf's actual handwriting, because it's like I discovered this book in some dusty old cupboard and now are discovering all these things about the novel that I never knew before. But also, this is such a London book, and it's quite poignant for me as an American living in London. So it inspired me to go around London yesterday and visit all these points that she talks about in Mrs. Dalloway. But because I luckily live in London, I went through all these spots immortalized in Woolf's novel. And, and even this morning, I went through and bought the flowers myself as a tribute to Mrs. Dalloway. So I'll go through some clips now and read some quotes from the novel as I visited all these various locations. For having lived in Westminster, how many years now? Over 20. One feels, even in the midst of the traffic or waking at night, Clarissa was positive, a particular hush or solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense, but that might be her heart affected, they said, by influenza, before Big Ben strikes. There, out it boomed, first a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Such fools we are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street, for heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh, but the veriest frumps, the most dejected of miseries, sitting on doorsteps, drink their downfall, do the same, can't be dealt with. She felt positive by acts of parliament for that very reason. They love life. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp, and trudge, in the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwich men, shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, in the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some airplane overhead was what she loved. Life, London, this moment in June. She had reached the park gates. She stood for a moment, looking at the omnibuses in Piccadilly. She had the oddest sense of being herself invisible, unseen, unknown, there being no more marrying, no more having of children now, but only this astonishing and rather solemn progress with the rest of them, up Bond Street, this being Mrs. Dalloway, not even Clarissa any more, this being Mrs. Richard Dalloway. But what was she dreaming as she looked into Hatchard's shop window? What was she trying to recover? What image of white dawn in the country as she read in the book spread open? Fear no more the heat of the sun, nor the furious winter's rages. This late age in the world's experience had bred in them all men and women, a well of tears. Tears and sorrow, courage and endurance, a perfectly upright and stoical bearing. He had only to open his eyes, but a weight was on them, a fear. He strained, he pushed, he looked. He saw Regent's Park before him, long streamers of sunlight fawned at his feet. The trees waved, brandished. We welcome, the world seemed to say. We accept, we create. Beauty, the world seemed to say. And as if to prove it scientifically, wherever he looked at the houses, at the railings, at the antelopes stretching over the palings, beauty sprang instantly. To watch a leaf quivering in the rush of air was an exquisite joy. Up in the sky, swallows swooping, swerving, flinging themselves in and out, round and round, yet always with perfect control, as if elastics held them, and the flies rising and falling, and the sun spotting now this leaf. Now, I know it sounds sentimental, but I found it really poignant walking through the streets of London and imagining how Virginia Woolf must have done the same when she was plotting and planning how she would write this novel, and how little observations and things she noticed in the city must have gone into the novel as well. And it really reinforced the main ideas of the novel, of how there are these layers of time and memory that we experience just as we're walking down the street. And it made me reflect on my own past experiences and choices I've made or didn't make. And it made me want to go back to reading Woolf's novels as well, because every time I go back to reading her books, I always find new things. And, she just packs so much into one sentence. But I hope you've found that even if you think you know the novel Mrs. Dalloway, you'll see that there's still so much more to discover about about it. So leave comments below if you have any thoughts or questions or feelings about Woolf or any of her books. I'll leave all sorts of good links in the description below. But thank you for watching and following along with this Woolf Geekathon.